An 1884 history of Chicago begins with an image depicting Jean-Baptiste Dusable. In the book, he's described as the area's first landed proprietor and a handsome, rich, and faithful Negro. It also says he was the first disappointed man of Chicago following the flooding of his log cabin and his subsequent move to Missouri. A new exhibit at the Newberry Library points out that Dusable would not be the last disappointed black man or woman in the city.
We have parts of the exhibition that really celebrate the achievement of black Chicagoans and the African American community at large in Chicago, but we also wanted to show the struggles that they've gone through from the times that the first African American settlers in the 1840s on down to the present day.
The exhibit is called Civil War to Civil Rights, and it draws from the Newberry's extensive collections, presenting nearly 200 years of the African American experience in Chicago. One of the earliest and rarest of the artifacts is a photograph from the 1860s of a former slave named Nancy. She was brought to Chicago to serve as a nanny. The image of a black servant with her wards was almost unheard of at the time. Not long after, in 1871, a journalist and real estate developer by the name of John Jones became the first African-American Chicagoan voted into public office as a Cook County Commissioner.
He actually wrote in the Tribune in an article saying, you know, we must have our civil rights. So this idea of activism for African-American civil rights really has a long history in Chicago.
But at the dawn of the 20th century, civil and equal rights for African Americans were still far out of reach, especially in the Deep South. It prompted the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of African Americans to Chicago. As the century wore on, tensions between Chicago's black and white communities grew, reaching a violent boiling point in the summer of 1919. That's when a white man threw a rock and killed a black youth who accidentally swam into what was considered the white section of Lake Michigan. A policeman at the scene refused to act, and a week of rioting ensued.
What is really, I think, little known about this whole incident is most of the rioting was instigated by whites in African American communities. So you had white gangs going into the African American communities and burning their houses, inflicting damage.
A report called The Negro in Chicago was produced in the aftermath of the race riots.
Despite efforts like this that call attention to the injustices and the need for reform, any changes tended to be minor and temporary, so that this is a history that gets repeated again and again over the course of the 20th century and into the 21st century.
The railroad industry played an important role in the lives of African Americans in Chicago. Most famous among those railroads was the Pullman Palace Car Company. The Newberry Library has most of the company's records, everything from employment applications to an extensive collection of photographs. Some of those photos are glossy and staged publicity shots, but others depict the real world of black rail company workers.
They were paid very low wages and just expected to earn tips, which didn't bring them up to a living wage at all. So this spawned a very well-known labor organizing effort by the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters to organize these men into a union, and it wasn't until the New Deal, when legislation struck down company unions, that the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was officially recognized.
Chicago did not have Jim Crow laws on the books, but that did not prevent widespread housing discrimination for blacks. In some cases, white residents took matters into their own hands, forming what were called restrictive covenants or colored restrictions. A practice that formed a key plot point in Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun.
I mean, what do you think you're gonna gain by moving into a neighborhood where you just aren't wanted?
Entire neighborhoods would sign on to this practice that effectively excluded African Americans from living in that community. And this was prevalent all over Chicago.
But the exhibit is not all about hardships, discrimination, and struggles. Chicago has produced many distinguished African American artists, among them dance pioneer and civil rights activist Katherine Dunham. The exhibit also showcases the works of Chicago literary giants, including Langston Hughes.
I pick up my life and take it with me, and I put it down in Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Scranton, Harlem, any place that is north.
There's a first edition Richard Wright, and letters of Gwendolyn Blakely, who was born Gwendolyn Brooks. One section of the exhibit that was not part of the original plan takes on events from just the last few months.
So we adapted the exhibition to draw connections between the current climate of protest and the long struggle for African American civil rights in Chicago, really from the 1860s to the present.
Visitors are invited to leave their thoughts on Post-it notes that will become part of the Newberry's archives. From tragedies of enormous magnitude to little-known triumphs, the road from Civil War to civil rights has been a long one for Chicago African Americans. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Eddie Arruza.
Civil War to Civil Rights, African American Chicago in the Newberry collection runs through April 2nd. The library is holding a number of free related events.